Now we come to the part that puts the tools in your hand. How do you write about Africa ethically? Welcome and thank you everyone for making this time out to join this incredible conversation. I'm really inspired by the first speaker and really excited to build on what he has shared with us. We are joining you today to talk about ethical storytelling, why ethical storytelling matters, and why it is so important that we center ethics in our storytelling. Now, I'll remind you why ethical stories matter. Ethical stories lift up the inherent resourcefulness and power of individuals forced to grapple with systemic inequalities. The reason Africa No Filter advocates for ethical storytelling is that we did an analysis, a literature review on how stories about Africa are told and what frames are used. And across board, 5 frames emerged. The frame of conflict and war, of poverty, corruption, poor leadership, and disease. As a result of these 5 frames, Africa is seen to be broken and dependent, and Africans are seen to be lacking the agency to create the change that we want to see and innovate solutions for some of the most critical issues that the continent is experiencing. And the reason it's important to challenge these narratives is because there is a consequence and a cost to stereotypes. It's not harmless. One of the ways in which the cost of negative stereotypes shows up, we have seen, is it impacts aid and donor relations on the continent. It impacts business and investment on the continent. And it also impacts how the world sees us and how we as Africans also see ourselves and the continent. Please, can you move slides? Again, please. On to the next one. Great, thank you so much. Now, I want to answer why ethical storytelling matters. Of course, we all know that storytelling is the most powerful way for donors and non-governmental organizations to convey their work, because these stories allow audiences to collect emotionally and intellectually. However, much of the storytelling about development work in Africa perpetuates harmful and stereotypical narratives about the continent. These are the narratives and the stories that leave us feeling that we are reading about people without agency, about a continent that is only defined through brokenness and problems, never through solutions. Therefore, ethical storytelling becomes a necessary means of telling stories. It allows us to adopt a new approach that consciously tries to move away from harmful and stereotypical narratives of the continent and of Africans. Next slide, please. What does ethical storytelling look like? What does an ethical storytelling look like? It blurs the distinction between individual countries. It says that Africa, a continent of 54 countries, is one continent, and that this one continent, one country called Africa, only has a single story of poverty and suffering. And ethical stories focus on individuals and community deficits rather than their agency. The people or local organizations that are working to tackle the problem are seen to lack sufficient voices in these stories. Another way an ethical story shows up is through narratives that imply that only development organizations can solve the problems depicted in the story. Next slide, please. Unethical stories include pictures and photographs of Africans that are stereotypical and often reproduced from stock footage. They do not even depict the people in the story. And this is quite important, because we all know that a picture tells 1,000 words. And quite often the pictures that we see about Africa, certainly when I was training in journalism school, it was the pictures of poverty, it was the pictures of brokenness, it was pictures of war and despair. And these pictures did not only make the storytellers very famous and build them a profile. It also was rewarded through international journalism prizes like Pulitzer, which is great. Of course, a story gets out, it gets told, but the impact nonetheless remains long after the story has been told. It creates a narrative that relies on pity to sway audiences. Yes, we know that emotion is powerful, but unethical storytelling relies on the emotion of pity, not the emotion of hope and inspiration to sway audiences. And of course, Africa is described using stereotypical languages and terms. How many people in this room have ever read a story and somewhere down the line you see a sentence that says, in Malawi, where more than half of the population lives on less than $2 a day, in, that particular economic one, a line that so many of us repeat, but ultimately it is part of what contributes to stereotypical language when we write and talk about the continent. And finally, unethical storytelling creates a narrative that does not recognize and identify our common humanity. Next slide, please. So what are we looking for when we're looking for ethical storytelling? We're looking for stories that highlight assets that the individuals and communities have. Stories that show Africans as capable, innovative in solving problems. These are stories that highlight collaboration between Africans, not a donor organization as the hero saving Africans and communities. These also are stories in which African people and African organizations occupy a central role. These are stories that do not other Africans. These are stories about Africans told by Africans through Africans and through the experiences of Africans. Next slide, please. Ethical stories are the ones that do not shy away from discussing the problem, but they provide a local context, they provide nuance, and they give specific details such as statistics and names of places. Ethical stories do not rely on pity to engage an audience, as I already stated. Rather than treating every African country as if it's one country, the stories name specific countries and places in the story. And I think this is something that cannot be stressed enough. And at some stage, I know that even I myself, as a storyteller, was guilty of this because that was my training. I had to unlearn it. We simply lump African countries as one. Or you're writing about South Africa, you will say South Africa. But where in South Africa? You're writing about Kenya, where in Kenya? Where in Nairobi? Thank you. Next slide, please. Now we come to the part that puts the tools in your hand. How do you write about Africa ethically? Africa No Filter developed a guide, ethical storytelling guide, and it identifies 8 important steps that we believe that if storytellers, if development communicators follow these 8 steps, then they can start really writing from the principles of ethical storytelling. Number 1 is challenging unequal power relations. As a storyteller, you need to check your own privilege. What are your beliefs and attitudes that may create prejudice and that may, as a result of your prejudice, create harm for the people whose stories you're telling, the people you're engaging with. Number 2, ensuring respectful engagements. And this is very important because we know that Africa is such a nuanced continent. Here, respect matters. It carries a lot of weight. So it's important to also recognize that all engagements need to be respectful. I always say that respectful engagement to me looks like understanding that, for example, in South Africa, people who are in office, you can just refer them by their name and surname or Mr. whoever. But when I was traveling and interacting with people in Tanzania, I noticed that elders are called mzee or something else before even mentioning their title and names. So I needed to be mindful of that engagement, that it is respectful, because if I'm not respectful of it, then it means I'm not being ethical in my storytelling. The third step is tackling implicit bias in the hiring process. And I think this is something that we often see a lot with development in global NGOs that work in Africa, and they come to here to do their impact storytelling. It is not the African team, it's not an African journalist or videographer that's hired. It's a team that comes from New York, for example, and they're coming and they're telling that story. And that in itself already others, the Africans whose stories are being told, the people whose stories are being told, because it already removes them. Remember, one of the things I mentioned previously was that in unethical storytelling, Africans and Africa are not central to the narrative. The fourth one is addressing implicit bias in your own storytelling. And I think this is something that we are all very familiar with. It's something that we have all experienced, right? A story from ideation to execution needs you to always check your privilege and recognize the biases that you already have. The fifth step, the next slide, please, is using ethical guidelines and understanding informed consent. And this is especially important because consent is not just giving a form and saying you need to sign this form because I need to show that I spoke to a person on the ground. It is explaining what the story is about, how the story will be used, explaining in a language that the people you are addressing understand, so that again language doesn't become a barrier. And part of informed consent as well is explaining what happens to a story after you have written it. So for example, if you are collecting this story because you are doing a monitoring and evaluation report, you're doing an impact report, but you also imagine that it will potentially turn into social media content. It is something that can inspire a campaign. You want to do more about it. That is more than what the person knows or expects the story to be. You need to inform them at every single step of the way. And a big part of informed consent is, should anything change, even after consent has been granted, you have to go back to those people and engage them again. So for example, people who write a lot about conflict and women who've experienced sexual violence. Stories have been told by women in one case, but then a team of human rights lawyers read the story and felt moved to advocate for those women and wanted to fight for justice. And they went to the platform that wrote the story. The platform had to go back and call every single woman and explain what was happening, and further explain that as part of consent, you have right to refusal. Have I run out of time? I see my slide is gone. After informed consent is understanding the local context. This is important. What are the local protocols? What is required of you when you engage or interact with people in that community? The seventh one is investing time in your projects through thorough planning, scheduling, and resourcing. And the eighth one is investing in your people. Are people trained? Do people have the skills and resources to tell these stories? Do people know what to do in the physical spaces you put them in, right? Because speaking for myself, some of us work a lot in the office, but when you need to go out and go into the field, what skills have been invested that allow me to be able to carry out that story that I've been tasked with telling? Thank you. Next slide. Getting ethical storytelling right means creating better, more authentic stories that connect people of different backgrounds and disrupt inequitable power relations, such as race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, religion. Getting it right means representing lived experiences more accurately. It means encouraging mutual respect and preserving the dignity of those whose story is being told. Dignity is very, very important because when people share their stories, they're being vulnerable. Sometimes very vulnerable information comes out, and sometimes people even experience physical vulnerability that you can witness. You have to know when there's a time to put your pen down. You have to know if a picture that you have taken before you file, if that really dignifies the person who's being shown. And if it doesn't dignify them, then guess what? No matter how powerful it is, no matter how much you realize that it could even move thousands and hundreds of people to get behind your cause, you have to go back and ask yourself, am I compromising their dignity? If the answer is yes, it's not ethical. I encourage you to let it go. Next